I want to read you a piece of scripture, and I think if you stay with me, maybe you'll see early Christian writings differently. My name is Chris. I have Master of Divinity, Master of Arts in Theology, PhD in Christian Origins, and on this channel I talk about the Bible and early Christianity, so subscribe. But let's read this. This child Jesus, when 5 years old, was playing in the ford of a mountain stream, and he collected the flowing waters into pools and made them clear immediately, and by a word alone he made them obey him. And having some soft clay, he fashioned out of it 12 sparrows. And it was the Sabbath when he did these things, and there were also many other children playing with him. And a certain Jew, seeing what Jesus was doing, playing on the Sabbath, went off immediately, and said to his father Joseph, Behold, thy son is at the stream, and has taken clay and made of it 12 birds, and has profaned the Sabbath. And Joseph, coming to the place and seeing, cried out to him, saying, Wherefore dost thou on the Sabbath what is not lawful to do? And Jesus clapped his hands, and cried out to the sparrows, and said to them, Off ye go. And the sparrows flew, and went off crying. And the Jews, seeing this, were amazed, and went away, and reported to their chief men what they had seen Jesus doing. Now, if you know your New Testament pretty well, you might recognize this story is not in your New Testament. If you don't know the New Testament super well, you would be forgiven for thinking this isn't the New Testament. It's not. This is actually from an early Christian writing called the INFANCY Gospel of Thomas. And the INFANCY Gospel of Thomas preserves a lot of stories about Jesus' upbringing. Now, I use the word preserves there. That's probably not the right word, but the Infancy Gospel of Thomas does have these unusual stories about Jesus' upbringing. And if I'm not mistaken, I think this one actually worked its way into the Quran as well. I was reading a textbook not long ago talking about where some of these stories came from, and the textbook kind of explained it like this. It said, well, people were just curious. So, if they knew about Jesus, they say, well, what was he like as a child? And then somebody came along and wrote that story about what Jesus was like as a child. And that's a really interesting observation. So we have a world where people know about Jesus. They want to know more. Somebody comes along and writes a story about what Jesus was like as a child. But that really begs the question, what's the difference between that and our Gospels? Why are we so quick to see our Gospels as history and to look at something like this that a lot of early Christians, we don't know how widely it was circulated, but obviously some early Christians read, and they couldn't tell the difference. If you walked into a church in Egypt somewhere and they handed you an Infancy Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Luke, for example, and said, okay, which of these is actually true about the historical Jesus, the reader wouldn't be able to tell the difference. And the obvious question is, why will so many of us, and maybe some of you watching, think that this story is historic fabrication? In fact, you'll pretty much know right away that it's historic fabrication, and I agree with you, it probably is. You'll think that this story is historic fabrication, but then those same people will turn around and argue that the Gospels are 100% eyewitness accounts of the life of Jesus. And you have to ask the question, if people are following Jesus and, there's a religion, it's a problematic word, but there's a religion, let's say, or a movement based around following Jesus that is growing in the ancient world, and people want these kinds of stories about Jesus, why wouldn't we make the same argument about the Gospels? Why wouldn't we also see the Gospels as being some ancient writer's attempt to fill in some of the details about the life of Jesus that you might not otherwise know? And I think we don't really devote enough time to these kinds of questions. And I think it betrays something that's really kind of universal about the way that we often approach early Christian texts. And I mean, so many of us, like me, coming out of a Christian upbringing, I still practice Christianity. I think so often we have a tendency to not question our own myths. And it's very interesting to think about how easily we can dismiss the myths of other people. And I'm like, so many Christians can look at another religious text or another religion's claims, or even the claims of something like this that is from early Christianity but didn't end up making it into the canon. A lot of Christians can look at that and see that as being suspect. They can see, like, quite rightly, your spidey senses tingle, quite rightly, you look at this stuff and say, I don't trust that. There seems to be some ulterior motive there. But then we can turn around and try to apply a standard to the Gospels, for example, that we wouldn't give to any other piece of ancient literature. And what's the difference there? What's the difference? Is it because the Gospels, somehow lend such a higher air of credibility by their writing? Is it because the Gospels are so much more believable? I mean, there are just as many miracles and supernatural events in the Gospels. I think a lot of people who would say this story about Jesus isn't true would turn around and say, well, the supernatural claims about Jesus in the Gospels are true. Fair enough. That's a pretty common way for a Christian to think about the Bible. But the main difference for a lot of us is just that we have been told the Gospels are true. We've been reading them our entire life, and we have seen them as not fantastical works of fiction and not even kind of mythologized biography. We've seen them as historical accounts of things that actually happened. And I've critiqued that idea in other videos. I'm not going to get into it in this one, but the real interesting thing is that we have this tendency to treat the Gospels as differently, not because they deserve to be treated as differently per se. I think the best argument that they do would be to argue that we have the right canon, and that's why I think a lot of people do devote a lot of time to trying to argue about canon, but there's nothing inherently more believable or less mythological or less questionable about the Gospels. The difference is we've read them our whole lives. The difference is many of us have heard them so many times, we take them for granted. And when you hear the claims of another religion, like somebody digging up golden plates, you think, yeah, that's bullshit, because your meter still works. Your mythological meter, your bullshit meter, if we want to call it that, still works for other traditions and still works for other stories and would work for ancient Greek and Roman stories if we told those too. But that same thing gets turned off when we're dealing with our own tradition. And it's a really interesting historical and human phenomenon. There's emotional underpinning of this. And I think that's okay. Like, I think it's hard to approach religious texts as historical documents. And we have to kind of almost make ourselves a little uncomfortable when we do this. And I love this. I love doing this and staying within the Christian tradition, but some people can't. And some people have conceived of Christianity in such a way that they can't ask these hard questions without their faith being challenged or being at risk. And I think that's a shame. I think if you want to see really interesting things in early Christianity, apply the critical lens that you so easily can apply to other religions or to Greco-Roman stuff or to non-canonical early Christian writings. Apply that critical lens to the Gospels or the letters of Paul or anything in the New Testament or anything in the Hebrew Bible for that matter, and what you see will change your life. And I think the simple act of doing that, of being willing to ask the same questions of your own texts that you would ask of anybody else's text or any other ancient text, really produces some absolutely incredible things and makes it way more fun to read these texts than to approach them treating them with kid gloves because you've already decided they're special and you can't ask those same questions of your own texts. Hope that was interesting. Let me know what you think. As always, love to hear it. Subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you next time.